A new code of practice has been finalised to vet and teach tourist drivers who are renting vehicles here in New Zealand. It comes after concerns were raised about the safety of foreign drivers on our roads. Not all of them, but some of them. You know the ones. So how does the code work? Joining me now is Tourism Industry Association Chief Executive Chris Roberts. Chris, good morning to you.
Good morning, Paul.
Thanks for joining us. So now, you have trialled this code, and in the first instance, it literally is a crafted selection of questions that people are asked when they turn up at the counters, yes?
Well, the assessment actually comes at the end of the process. This is actually about informing the drivers, so most of the work happens before they actually get to the country in terms of having information on websites, providing information to them when they make their booking, more information again before they arrive in New Zealand, and then that assessment happens once they come and pick up the keys.
Right. Now, the assessment is the vitally important component here because it is the only way of knowing whether or not they've accessed any of those other tools that you've put in place, isn't it?
It is the only time you get to meet them face to face, but what we want to do is have as well-informed would-be drivers at the earliest possible stage, because if we get to them early, they may decide, if they're not a competent driver, then to choose some other method of holiday in New Zealand. So we don't want to rely on trying to assess them when they get to the counter.
No, absolutely. But still, you have to, once you get to the counter, that's the point at which you have to actually make the final assessment. Are these people capable of driving on New Zealand roads or not?
Yes, and as you say, we've trialled that with a number of companies for a month, and there were a number of drivers refused the keys as a result of that process.
How many?
It's going to be up to half a dozen drivers were refused keys. It's up to each company to decide how they go about that, whether they refuse to hand over the keys if they're uncertain about the driver's competency. They might choose to take the driver for a quick test or some other method of assessing whether they're comfortable letting that driver have their vehicle.
What was the response to these questions? And very quickly, I'll run through them. I won't run through them all, but there are only a few. Are you familiar with New Zealand road rules? Are you familiar with the Drive Safe website? Have you driven regularly in your home country in the past year? Do you feel prepared to drive in New Zealand? What were people who were asking these questions? What was the feedback that you got from the trial? Were people honestly answering them?
I think generally we only hear secondhand from the companies, but we think they were generally answering them honestly. The main concern would be someone who only recently got their licence in an offshore jurisdiction and had never driven overseas before. So that raises some alarm bells as to their experience behind the wheel. And then, of course, driving in our very different road conditions here in New Zealand. We have to remember that our conditions are literally quite foreign for a lot of visiting drivers.
Okay, so what happens? You're asking them the question. You're standing at the Avis counter in Queenstown. There's a queue of 20 people behind this person. You've said, have you driven regularly in your home country in the past year? And the person says no. So what will the person behind the counter then say to that person?
Again, it will come down to each company, but they may, as I say, they might choose to take them for a test. They may ask if there's anyone else in the party who could drive, who also has a licence, who may be a more capable driver. We really have to leave it up to each company to assess that. And of course, you'd be making the point that there's a queue at the counter, how long can they take to do this? What they'll be doing is pre-screening. So from the bookings they've already got, they will know, for example, that the Australian businessman who's here for his 21st visit doesn't need to be screened.
Sure.
But a visitor from the USA who's never been to New Zealand before might need a bit more attention.
Okay, and as you say, during the test was held in Queenstown, yes?
The tests were done around the country, but including Queenstown, yes.
Yeah, which is, you'd have to say, the epicenter of bad tourist driving in New Zealand, wouldn't you, really?
It's where it's most visible because, obviously over summer and actually over winter as well, it's where we have so many tourists and actually a low local population, so they're quite noticeable on the road.
You should be commended for actually doing something on this, Chris. Do you think it's going to make a big difference, yes or no?
Actually, I think it will. We are still going to have road crashes, and some of those road crashes will involve overseas drivers, but educated driver is certainly a safer driver.
Okay, and the indication is this might make a bit of a difference. Chris, thank you for joining us. Chris Roberts, Tourism Industry Association New Zealand Chief Executive.